The warehouse had no sign. It didn't need one. 4,000 people already knew where it was, past the address through encrypted messages, through friends of friends, through a network so reliable it hadn't failed a single Friday night in 3 years. The building sat on the edge of Florentine, a neighbourhood in South Tel Aviv where the streets smell like cumin and spray paint, and something electrical that has no name. By 3 a.m. on this particular Saturday in October 2019, the line outside stretched half a block. Nobody checked IDs at the door. The bass from inside was so low it didn't register as sound. It registered as pressure, a weight in the chest, a vibration that started in the concrete and moved upward through the body. Inside, the air was wet and white with fog machine vapour and the heat of thousands of moving bodies. The lights came in pulses, long darkness, then a flash, then darkness again. In those brief moments of light, the faces were visible, pupils wide enough to swallow the iris whole, jaws working slowly, rhythmically on nothing, hands raised not in celebration but in something closer to surrender. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Among those 4,000 people was a woman named Noah Shalef. 26 years old, short dark hair, a small scar above her left eyebrow from a fall she'd taken during a training exercise 4 years earlier. She was not in the centre of the crowd. She was near the back wall, leaning against it with her eyes closed and her arms loose at her sides, and the expression on her face was the specific expression of someone who has, at least for this moment, put down something very heavy. What she had put down, and how long she'd been carrying it, and what would happen when she had to pick it back up. None of that was visible. Not yet. Weeks after that night, a national survey landed on the desks of Israeli public health officials. The methodology was rigorous. Wastewater analysis from treatment plants serving Tel Aviv, cross-reference with hospital data, and a voluntary survey of 4,200 adults aged 18 to 35 across the country. The number that stopped the room was not the overall MDMA use rate, though that was alarming enough. It was this. Israel had the highest per capita MDMA consumption of any country on earth. Not the Netherlands, which makes most of the world's supply. Not the United Kingdom, which invented the culture around it. Not Australia, which has consumed it for decades at rates that baffled researchers. Israel, a country of 9 million people, roughly the population of New Jersey, a country surrounded by borders it cannot fully control, a country at war in some form or another for its entire modern existence, was consuming more MDMA per person than anywhere else on the planet. The number required a second reading, then a third. Israeli customs data from the same period showed that agents were seizing, on average, more MDMA per capita than any other country's border force, and seizures, by every law enforcement estimate, represent somewhere between 5 and 15% of what actually crosses, which meant the pills getting through, the ones nobody caught, represented a volume so large the math became difficult to hold in the mind. Tel Aviv was not just consuming. Tel Aviv was the distribution hub, the cultural engine, and the primary market simultaneously. The city was the factory and the customer at the same time. The question that followed was not the obvious one. The obvious question, why are so many people using it, had an obvious answer, and obvious answers are almost never the real ones. The real question, the one that took years of court documents, intelligence reports, and neuroscience research to begin to answer, was something else entirely. How did a molecule synthesized by accident in a German laboratory in 1912, patented and forgotten, classified and buried, rediscovered and celebrated and then criminalized, end up flowing into one small Middle Eastern country at a rate that had no parallel anywhere in the world? The answer ran through a Jungian therapist in California, a Texas nightclub owner who changed one word and altered history, a group of Manchester DJs on a Spanish island, Soviet immigrants who rebuilt themselves as something their home country never anticipated, a security service that knew everything and stopped nothing, and a generation of young Israelis who came home from military service carrying something no one had given them the tools to put down. It ran too through Noah Shalev, though she didn't know that yet. In the warehouse in Florentine, she opened her eyes. The light pulsed. The bass pressed against her ribs. Around her, 4,000 people moved in the particular synchrony of a crowd that is, individually, experiencing something it cannot share but is collectively sharing it anyway. She raised one hand, not high, just slightly, palm open, and held it there. Nobody watching would have known what she was feeling. Nobody watching could have guessed where she had started, or how far she had come to be standing in that warehouse at 3 a.m, with her palm open and her eyes finally clear. Nobody watching would have guessed either what this moment was costing her. The story of how Tel Aviv became the MDMA capital of the Middle East did not begin in Tel Aviv. It did not begin in the Middle East. It did not begin in a nightclub or a rave or a hospital ward or a police evidence room. It began in a laboratory. 1912. A German chemist named Anton Köllisch was working on something completely different, something that had nothing to do with emotional consciousness or the particular quality of light inside a warehouse at 3 a.m. He had no idea what he was making. He would be dead before he could find out, and the thing he made would outlive him by more than a century, cross every border on the map, enter the bloodstream of millions of people who had never heard his name, and arrive, eventually, inevitably, in the body of a 26-year-old woman leaning against a wall in South Tel Aviv, feeling for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, like herself. What Köllisch actually built in that Darmstadt laboratory, and why the century between his workbench and that warehouse was not a straight line but a spiral, tightening, that is where the story begins. Anton Köllisch was not trying to change anything. That is the first thing to understand about the morning in 1912 when he walked into the biopharmaceutical laboratory in Darmstadt, Germany, and began the synthesis that would, over the following century, move through military black sites, Californian therapy rooms, British fields full of 20-year-olds, and the sweat-soaked warehouses of South Tel Aviv. He was not a visionary. He was not a rebel. He was a 29-year-old staff chemist with a specific, narrow, entirely commercial assignment. Find a way to synthesize a blood-clotting compound that Bayer could patent before a competitor did. The competitor was Farbwerke Höchst. The compound they were racing toward was hydrastinine, a hemostatic agent, something to slow bleeding. Bayer needed an alternative route to a similar molecule, one that didn't infringe on existing patents. Köllisch was handed the problem the way any junior chemist is handed a problem, with a deadline and without much ceremony. He worked through the synthesis methodically. The chemistry involved breaking down safrole, a compound found in sassafras oil, through a sequence of reactions that produced intermediate molecules, each one a stepping stone toward the target. One of those intermediates, produced almost as a structural footnote, was methylsafrilamine. Köllisch modified it. The resulting compound was 3,4-methylandioxymethamphetamine, MDMA, made in a Tuesday afternoon in 1912, filed in a patent application, given no particular name. Bayer's patent lodged on December 24, 1912. Christmas Eve, a detail that has the flavour of something invented, listed the compound not as a drug or a therapy or a substance of interest, but as an intermediate step in a process, a means to an end. The patent made no claims about its effects on the human nervous system because nobody had tested it on a human nervous system. Nobody thought to. The goal was the blood clotting agent, and MDMA was not that. It was a byproduct of a failed shortcut, the chemical equivalent of a wrong turn that leads somewhere nobody had planned to go. Kurlish moved on to other work. Bayer filed the patent and did nothing with it. The compound sat in the catalogue. Then the world interrupted. World War I consumed Europe 2 years later, and Anton Kurlish was conscripted. He died in September 1916 on the Western Front, 4 years after synthesizing a molecule that would outlive him by more than a century. He was 33 years old. He left no record of any particular interest in the compound he'd made. There is no evidence he ever thought about it again after filing the patent. The patent itself gathered dust through 2 world wars. The compound sat in Bayer's records, untouched and untested, while the 20th century moved through its most catastrophic decades. No researcher pulled it from the shelf. No physician considered it. It existed only on paper, a structural formula, a filing date, a footnote in a patent that nobody read. For 40 years, nothing. The quiet ended not with a publication or a press release, but with a classified order. In 1953, the United States Army's Chemical Corps, the division responsible for exploring chemical agents for military purposes, operating under a program that would later be partially exposed as MK Ultra's less famous sibling, quietly obtained Bayer's records on a range of psychoactive compounds. MDMA was among them. The army wasn't interested in its blood-clotting properties. They were interested in something else entirely, whether it could be used to make people talk, to dissolve resistance, to lower the psychological defences of a subject in an interrogation room. The Cold War had created a specific appetite for substances that could do to a mind what a crowbar does to a locked door. The Army's experiments with MDMA between 1953 and the early 1960s remain only partially declassified. What is known comes from documents released under Freedom of Information requests decades later. Sparse, heavily redacted pages that confirm the experiments happened and reveal almost nothing about what they found. One document from 1954 lists MDMA alongside mescaline, LSD, and several compounds with no common name, all described as candidates for potential utility in psychochemical warfare applications. Whether MDMA worked as an interrogation tool, the documents don't say. What they confirm is that the United States military tested it on human subjects, soldiers, in at least some cases, without their full knowledge of what they were receiving. The results were classified. The compound was given a military designation code, EA1475, and filed away. A different kind of filing, but filed again nonetheless. The world outside those black-walled testing rooms had no idea any of this was happening. In 1953, the year the Army began its experiments, MDMA did not exist in public consciousness. It had no street name, it had no cultural identity, it had no users in any voluntary sense. It was a military secret inside a program that was itself a secret, buried under layers of classification in a decade that treated government secrecy as a matter of national survival. 11 years passed. The Army's program wound down. The classified files were sealed. Then a man in California opened his notebook and started asking questions that nobody in a position of authority wanted asked. Gordon Alice was a pharmacologist, not a military contractor, and his relationship with MDMA was older than the Army's. He had self-administered a related compound, amphetamine, in the 1920s and had built a career on understanding how molecules move through the brain. In the mid-1960s, working from Bayer's original patent records, which were by then technically public though practically invisible, Alice synthesized MDMA and administered it to himself. His notes from that session, preserved and later published, described the specific quality of what he experienced with the precision of a scientist and the bewilderment of someone who has just encountered something no existing language properly fits. He recorded heightened sensory awareness, a dissolution of the usual distance between his thoughts and his emotions, an unusual clarity about his own mental state. He also recorded a complete absence of the paranoia and perceptual distortion associated with LSD. The compound, he wrote, produced a state of empathic openness that felt fundamentally different from any psychedelic he had studied. He published his findings. Nobody paid meaningful attention. In 1965, MDMA was not a scandal or a crisis or a phenomenon. It was a paragraph in a pharmacology journal. The culture that would eventually carry it to 4,000 people in a Tel Aviv warehouse was not yet imaginable. The molecule was still waiting, patient and inert and utterly unknown, for the man who would finally understand what it was for. That man was not yet looking for it. He was in his backyard in Lafayette, California, building a laboratory out of materials he'd ordered through the mail, surrounded by roses his wife tended, and the particular Northern California light that falls differently in autumn, thinking about a different compound entirely. His name was Alexander Shulgin, and what he was about to do to MDMA would set every subsequent event in motion. The therapy rooms, the nightclubs, the smuggling networks, the government hearings, the warehouse in Florentine, the woman with her palm open and her eyes finally closed. He hadn't found MDMA yet, but he was getting closer, and when he did, the 40 years of silence that had followed Anton Kurlisch's accidental synthesis would end so completely and so irreversibly that the world before it would become almost impossible to remember. What Shulgin did with the molecule, and what the molecule then did with the world, that was not the story anyone expected, least of all him. Alexander Shulgin did not look like someone who would rewrite the pharmacological history of the 20th century. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the unhurried manner of a man who had made peace with the fact that most people would never understand what he was working on. He kept bees. He grew roses. His laboratory, a converted outbuilding behind his house in Lafayette, California, 40 minutes east of San Francisco, was cluttered with equipment he had built or modified himself, glass apparatus arranged on wooden shelves, notebooks stacked in no immediately obvious order, the smell of solvents hanging in the air like something permanently resident. His neighbours knew him as the retired Dow chemical researcher who was always puttering with something in his backyard shed. What he was actually doing in that shed would eventually produce a DEA investigation, a 2-volume book that became the most detailed catalogue of psychoactive compounds ever published by a private individual, and the resurrection of a molecule that had been sitting untouched in a buyer patent file for 60 years. In 1976, Shulgin resynthesized MDMA from scratch. He had encountered a reference to the compound through a graduate student, not through the military records and not through Alice's largely ignored 1960s research. The reference was brief, a structural note in an academic paper about amphetamine analogues. Most chemists would have moved past it. Shulgin wrote it down, went home, and spent several weeks reconstructing the synthesis in his backyard laboratory, working from the molecular structure outward, the way a musician works backward from a melody to find the key it's written in. When the synthesis was complete, he followed the protocol he'd developed over 2 decades of self-experimentation. He tested the compound on himself in incrementally increasing doses, waiting days between each one, recording everything: heart rate, emotional state, quality of thought, the texture of perception. He kept his wife Anne informed of every session. She sat nearby during some of them, watching. What he recorded after his first full dose of MDMA was unlike anything in his notebooks to that point. The compound produced no hallucinations. nothing that distorted the physical world around him. There was no paranoia, no confusion about where he was or who he was. What it produced instead was a quality of emotional presence that he described, in the careful language of a scientist who distrusted hyperbole, as an almost complete dissolution of the usual static between thought and feeling. The distance a person normally maintains between what they actually feel and what they are willing to acknowledge they feel. MDMA appeared to simply remove it. Not replace it with something artificial, remove it. He was 58 years old when he took it for the first time. He had spent decades studying psychoactive compounds. He wrote in his notebook that he had never encountered anything that functioned quite like this. He also wrote that it had obvious therapeutic applications, immediately, clearly, without ambiguity. The person he gave it to next was Leo Zeff. Zeff was 69 years old, a Jungian psychoanalyst based in Oakland with 4 decades of clinical experience and a reputation among his peers as someone who had spent years quietly exploring whether psychedelic compounds could accelerate the therapeutic process. He had been considering retirement. His work felt, by his own later account, as though it had reached a plateau. The tools available to him in a therapy room were producing results, but slowly, and not always where the deepest damage lived. Shulgin drove to Oakland, sat across from Zeff, and gave him a small quantity of MDMA, along with his notes on what to expect. What happened in that session Zeff never described in clinical detail. What is documented is what he did immediately afterward. He cancelled his retirement. He spent the next decade training other therapists, quietly, through networks of referral and trust, entirely outside any institutional framework, in the use of MDMA as a therapeutic adjunct. By the time MDMA was criminalized in 1985, Zeff had personally trained an estimated 4,000 therapists across the United States and Europe. He called the compound Adam, not for any religious reason, but because of how it seemed to return people to a state before their defenses had fully formed, before the accumulated damage of a life had built its walls. The sessions he ran and trained others to run were not recreational. They were structured, supervised, intentional. Vietnam veterans who hadn't slept without nightmares in a decade came out of single sessions describing something they couldn't fully articulate. Not that the memories were gone, but that the memories had somehow lost their teeth. Couples who had spent years building sophisticated architectures of resentment and distance found, in a single afternoon, that they could see each other again. A woman in her 50s who had not discussed her childhood abuse with anyone in 30 years described it, in one session, with a steadiness that shocked her therapist and herself. None of this was published. None of it was submitted to the FDA. The therapist working with Zeff understood, without being told explicitly, that institutional scrutiny would end the work before it could be properly understood. So it remained underground, documented in private notes, passed between practitioners through personal introductions, invisible to the regulatory world that might have engaged with it. MDMA was still legal. That fact was central to everything that followed, and to the specific catastrophe that followed that. Because while Zeff's network was building its quiet clinical practice on the West Coast, something entirely different was happening in Texas. Michael Clegg was not a therapist. He was an entrepreneur with a background in the distribution of illegal substances and an eye for an untapped market. In 1983, a contact introduced him to MDMA, not in a therapy room but in a social setting, at a party in Dallas where a small group of people were passing around capsules of a compound they called by various informal names. Clegg recognized something immediately. Not what the therapist had seen, not the clinical potential, not the depth of the emotional processing. He recognized that the compound made people feel extraordinarily good and that there was no law against selling it. He formed a distribution company, He hired chemists to produce MDMA at scale. He established a supply chain that moved product through Texas, California, and Florida, primarily through nightclubs and bars, and he made one decision that would, in retrospect, determine how an entire generation understood the substance and misunderstood it. He needed a name. The therapeutic community called it Adam. Shulgin and his colleagues used the chemical abbreviation. Clegg's marketing instinct told him that neither would sell. He considered several options. One of his early candidates was empathy, a direct description of what the compound actually did, the quality that had made Zeph cancel his retirement, the mechanism that gave the Vietnam veterans their first unguarded nights in years. He chose ecstasy instead. The reasoning, according to accounts from people involved in Clegg's operation at the time, was straightforward. Ecstasy implied peak experience, euphoria, transcendence. It implied something people would pay for and seek out and return to. Empathy implied a therapy session. Ecstasy implied a Saturday night. That single word, the swap of one noun for another, reframed the compound in the public imagination so completely that the reframing outlasted the legality of the drug itself, the careers of everyone involved in its early distribution, and most of the original therapeutic research. From the moment Clegg's pills hit Dallas nightclubs in 1983 with ecstasy printed on their packaging, the compound was no longer what Kullish had accidentally made, or what the army had classified, or what Shulgin had carefully reconstructed in his backyard. It was a party drug. That identity adhered to it like a stain that no subsequent research could fully lift. Within 18 months of Clegg's launch, his operation was moving an estimated 500,000 doses per month. Legal doses, sold openly, in bars, over the counter, at $20 per capsule, alongside cocktails and beer. Buyers were told it was a new legal high. Some bars advertised it on chalkboards beside the happy hour specials. There was no age restriction, no dosage guidance, no warning about the neurological mechanism being engaged or the depletion that would follow. The DEA was watching. By late 1984, agents in Dallas had begun documenting Clegg's operation. They were not watching because of reported harms. At that point, the documented harm profile was thin. They were watching because a psychoactive substance with a chemical structure related to amphetamine was being sold commercially at massive scale, and the agency had a framework for how that story ended, even if this particular chapter was still being written. What the DEA did next, and the specific mechanism they used, and the man inside the agency who made the critical decision, would determine not just whether MDMA became illegal, but whether the therapeutic research Zeph had spent a decade building would survive at all. It would not survive, not in any recognizable form, not for a very long time. But before the ban came down, there was one more thing that needed to happen, something quieter than Clegg's Dallas operation, something that took place in therapy rooms and private sessions across the country, something that a small community of researchers believed was the most important clinical discovery in decades. What they had found, and what they were about to lose, was only visible in the case files that were never published, the sessions that were never filmed, the outcomes that were never submitted to a journal because submitting them would have ended the work before it could save anyone else. Those files still exist. What they contain is the thing nobody wanted the DEA to see. The brain has a chemical it releases when a person feels safe enough to be honest. Not safe from physical danger, safe from judgment, from the particular exhaustion of managing how one appears to another person. Serotonin is part of it. Oxytocin is part of it. But the specific cocktail that produces genuine emotional openness, the state in which a person can look at something they have spent years not looking at, that is not something the brain produces easily or reliably on its own. Trauma locks it down. Military training locks it down with particular efficiency. because the psychological architecture required to function under fire is precisely the architecture that makes civilian emotional life feel like a language one has partially forgotten. Noa Shalev completed her mandatory IDF service in 2015 at 22 years old. She had served in an intelligence unit, the kind of work that involves screens more than weapons, patterns more than combat, but carries its own specific weight. The things she processed in those 2 years were not things she was permitted to discuss. More precisely, they were not things she was equipped to discuss, because the training that made her effective at the work had given her no corresponding training in what to do with it afterward. She came home to Ramat Gan, moved into a small apartment with a roommate she barely knew, and began looking for a job in Tel Aviv's expanding tech sector. She was, by every visible measure, fine. Her hands didn't shake. She slept. She went to work and was competent and occasionally funny in the particular dry way of people who've learned to keep most of their register below the surface. What she had brought back from her service was not a diagnosable condition. It was more like a narrowing, a reduction in the bandwidth of ordinary feeling, a faint but persistent distance between herself and the texture of her own life. She didn't have a name for it. Most people in her situation didn't. In the autumn of 2015, 3 months after her discharge, a friend invited her to a small gathering in an apartment in South Tel Aviv. Not a party. 6 people, floor cushions, low music, a kitchen table with wine on it. The friend, a woman she'd known since secondary school, had something to offer alongside the wine. She described it carefully, more carefully than the circumstances suggested she needed to, because she had thought about how to say it. She said it was not like alcohol and not like the recreational drugs Noah might have encountered in the army or at university. She said it was more like a door that was already in you, that you had just forgotten how to open. Noah took the small white capsule and held it in her palm for several minutes before swallowing it. What MDMA does to a brain begins in the first 20 minutes and proceeds with a logic that, understood neurologically, is almost elegant in its mechanism. The compound enters the bloodstream and moves rapidly across the blood-brain barrier, the protective membrane that filters what reaches the brain from the body. Once across, it targets 3 neurotransmitter systems simultaneously. Serotonin first. MDMA causes a massive release of serotonin, the molecule most associated with mood regulation, social bonding, and the sense that the present moment is, at its baseline, acceptable. Dopamine second. The reward signal, the mechanism of motivation and pleasure, floods the synaptic gaps between neurons in quantities that normal experience rarely produces. Norepinephrine. Third, the alertness compound, the one that makes the body feel awake and present and slightly electric. But MDMA does something else that distinguishes it from every other compound in its chemical family. It simultaneously blocks the reuptake of those neurotransmitters, meaning the molecules don't get recycled back into the neurons that released them. They stay in the gaps between neurons, active and signaling, far longer than they normally would. The brain is not just flooded, it is held in the flood. The result in experiential terms is not euphoria in the way the word is commonly used. It is closer to the removal of a noise the person had stopped noticing, a background static of vigilance and self-monitoring and social calibration that runs constantly in most people, louder in some, nearly deafening in those who have trained themselves to be permanently alert, simply stops, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement. It stops the way a refrigerator motor stops in the middle of the night. The silence arrives, and only in the silence does the person realize how much noise there had been. Noah noticed it first as a softening in her shoulders, then as a quality of attention. She became interested in the face of the person sitting across from her, with an intensity that had nothing predatory or anxious in it, just interest. just the uncomplicated wish to understand what another person was actually thinking. She had not felt that quality of attention in years, and the recognition of its absence arrived simultaneously with its return, the way a person realizes they've been cold only when they step into warmth. She sat in that apartment for 4 hours. She did not dance. She did not feel what she would later describe to a friend as the party version. She felt instead that she had access to the contents of her own mind in a way that the previous 3 months, and she understood dimly, the 2 years before that, had not permitted. Memories from her service surfaced not as intrusions, but as things she could look at from a distance, examine, and then set down. She cried once, quietly, for reasons she couldn't immediately explain. In the morning she felt tired and slightly tender, as though she had run a long distance. She also felt unmistakably better, in some dimension she couldn't precisely locate. What she didn't know, because nobody in that apartment told her, and there was no particular reason they would have known to, was what was happening on the other side of the neurological equation. The serotonin that MDMA had flooded through her brain had come from somewhere. The brain does not manufacture neurotransmitters in unlimited quantities. It maintains reserves, replenishes them gradually through metabolic processes that take time. A massive serotonin release of the kind MDMA produces depletes those reserves significantly. In the days following the session, serotonin levels in the brain drop measurably below their normal baseline. The emotional flatness that many users describe in the days after MDMA, a greyness, a muted quality to ordinary experience, is not psychological. It is neurological. The brain is depleted and it is recovering. That recovery, for an occasional user with adequate time between sessions, is complete. The neuroscience on this is reasonably clear. 6 to 8 weeks between uses, the research suggested, was the threshold below which the brain could restore its serotonin system fully. Below that threshold, with more frequent use, the depletion began to compound. Noah would not know any of this for years. The therapists in Leo Zeff's network knew it, in broad terms. The protocol they used, low doses, sessions spaced months apart, extensive integration work between sessions, was designed precisely to avoid depletion. The work they were doing with veterans and trauma survivors was not casual. It was structured, careful, documented in private case files that described outcomes the mainstream psychiatric community had not come close to achieving with any available approved treatment. One of those files belonged to a man named David Weiss. Weiss was a 41-year-old Vietnam veteran living in Marin County when he entered the underground therapeutic network in 1982, 3 years before the ban. He had been in conventional therapy for 11 years. He had tried 3 different antidepressant medications, each with partial results and side effects that he described, in the intake notes his therapist kept as trading one set of problems for a smaller set of different problems. He slept with a light on. He had not sat in a restaurant with his back to the door since 1971. His first MDMA session lasted 5 hours. The therapist's notes from the following week recorded that Weiss had returned to the same restaurant where he'd had a panic attack 8 months earlier, chosen a seat in the middle of the room, and stayed for an entire meal. The note did not analyse why. It just recorded what had happened, in the flat documentary language of clinical observation. He returned for 2 more supervised sessions over the following year. The nightmares, present continuously for a decade, reduced by his own account to once or twice a month. He stopped taking the antidepressants that had produced at best a manageable numbness. His file was one of thousands like it in Zeff's network. None of them were published. The therapeutic community understood that publication meant scrutiny, and scrutiny, given the compound's chemical relationship to amphetamines and the political climate of the early 1980s, meant scheduling. Scheduling meant the end of the work. So they stayed quiet, and they continued, and they believed that the results would eventually speak for themselves through some future channel that wouldn't require them to expose what they were doing before it was complete. They miscalculated the speed of the DEA. By 1984, the agency had been watching Michael Clegg's Dallas operation for months. The volume of product, 500,000 doses monthly, moving through nightclubs across 3 states, had crossed the threshold from monitoring to action. What the DEA did not do, and what would become one of the defining institutional failures of the era, was distinguish between Clegg's commercial operation and Zeph's therapeutic network. In the agency's framework, the compound was the compound. The context of its use was not a variable the scheduling mechanism was designed to weigh. The decision had already been made, the paperwork was already being drafted. In Oakland, Leo Zeph was 72 years old and still seeing patients. He did not know that the window was about to close, that the careful decade of underground work his network had built was about to be swept into the same category as a Dallas nightclub's chalkboard special. His case files, Vice and hundreds like him, sat in a filing cabinet in his office on a quiet street in the hills above the city. In Darmstadt, Germany, Anton Kurlisch's 1912 patent had been public record for 70 years. In a backyard shed in Lafayette, Alexander Shulgin was already working on the book that would eventually publish every detail of every synthesis he had ever performed. A decision that would itself trigger a federal investigation, but not before the information was already in print, already irretrievable. The molecule was moving faster than any institution could contain it. It had already crossed too many borders: chemical, therapeutic, commercial, cultural. What happened next would not stop the movement. It would only change its direction. The DEA was 3 months from making its move. Inside the agency, one administrator had a document on his desk. The document contained a recommendation. He had not signed it yet. What he decided, and what he chose to ignore in order to decide it, that was the thing that would echo through every subsequent decade. The document on Francis Young's desk was not a recommendation. It was a finding. Young was the DEA's chief administrative law judge, not a politician, not an appointee beholden to a particular policy agenda, but a career legal officer whose job was to weigh evidence and render judgment. In 1984, when the DEA initiated emergency scheduling proceedings against MDMA, Young was assigned to oversee the formal hearing process. What followed was, by the standards of federal administrative law, unusually thorough. Researchers testified. Psychiatrists testified. Therapists from Zeph's network testified. Carefully, selectively, revealing enough to make the clinical case without fully exposing the underground infrastructure they had spent a decade building. Patients testified about outcomes that no approved psychiatric treatment had produced for them. Young listened to all of it. He reviewed the pharmacological literature. He applied the legal standard required for Schedule I classification, the most restrictive category in the federal drug control system, reserved for substances with no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Schedule I was where heroin lived, where LSD lived, the category that cut off all research access, all therapeutic application, all legal supply. His ruling, delivered in May 1986, found that MDMA did not meet the Schedule I criteria. He found that it had demonstrated accepted medical use. He found that the evidence from therapeutic settings was substantial enough to warrant continued research under controlled conditions. He recommended Schedule III, a category that allowed prescription use and research, and he put his reasoning in writing with the specificity of a man who understood his ruling would be contested. The DEA administrator read the ruling. His name was John Lawn. He had the legal authority, under the Controlled Substances Act to accept or reject his own judge's recommendation. He rejected it. On March 23, 1988, MDMA was permanently placed in Schedule 1. Lorne's written justification cited the compound's abuse potential and the absence of FDA-approved medical protocols, a circularity that the researchers who had testified immediately identified. The compound couldn't accumulate approved protocols if it was Schedule 1, because Schedule 1 prohibited the research required to generate those protocols. The door had been locked from the inside, and the key was on the wrong side of it. Leo Zeff died in 1988, the same year the permanent scheduling took effect. He was 75 years old. The filing cabinet in his Oakland office, containing records of therapeutic sessions stretching back nearly a decade, documenting outcomes that no approved treatment had matched, passed to colleagues who understood that the information inside it was now, in a very specific legal sense, evidence of a federal crime. Nobody published it. The files went into storage. David Weiss, the veteran from Marin County who had sat in the middle of a restaurant for the first time in 11 years, continued his life without the treatment that had made it possible, because the treatment no longer legally existed. But the compound still existed. It was molecules in the world. Law does not dissolve chemistry. What criminalization actually did to MDMA was the thing that law enforcement models consistently fail to predict. It removed the safeguards without removing the supply, displaced the careful from the careless, and handed the distribution network to people who had no interest in therapeutic protocols or neurological caution or the 6 to 8 week rule that separated a beneficial experience from a depleting one. Within 24 months of the 1985 emergency scheduling, before Young's ruling, before Lorne's override, while the legal question was still technically open, MDMA was available in every major American city. Not in bars with chalkboard menus, in clubs, in parking lots, in folded paper passed between people who did not know the seller's name. The price dropped. The purity dropped with it. The dosage, which Clegg's commercial operation had kept relatively consistent, became entirely unpredictable. Then it crossed the Atlantic, and the story changed scale entirely. The precise mechanism of transmission was a flight from New York to London in 1987, or possibly several flights in several months. The specifics depend on which account is accurate, and there are at least 4 competing ones. What is not disputed is the destination, Ibiza, the Spanish island that had been a low-key bohemian retreat since the 1960s, and was, by the mid-1980s, beginning its transformation into something else. A group of British DJs and promoters, among them figures who would later be credited with inventing the British dance music industry, encountered MDMA on the island during the summer of 1987. They brought it home. The British context was specific and important. The UK in 1987 was 3 years past the miners' strike, 2 years into a prolonged economic restructuring that had gutted the industrial north and culturally primed for exactly the kind of collective release that MDMA, and the particular music being built around it, 4-on-the-floor electronic rhythms, a tempo calibrated almost precisely to a heart rate elevated by the compound, could provide. The acid house scene emerged almost overnight in London and Manchester, and at its centre was a chemical experience that the music had been, unknowingly, engineered to amplify. The summer of 1988 became known as the second summer of love. The numbers from that summer are still difficult to fully verify, but the estimates from UK law enforcement records and retrospective public health surveys converge on something remarkable. Approximately 500,000 people took MDMA on a single weekend in the summer of 1988. Not over the course of a summer, a weekend. In fields outside London, in warehouses in Manchester, in parking structures in Leeds. The British government had no framework for what it was watching. Nothing in the criminalisation playbook covered 500,000 simultaneous users in a country where the compound had been controlled since 1977. The deaths began. Not immediately, not in large numbers, but with the specific accumulating weight of events that begin to define an era. The death that defined this one happened in Essex, England, on November 11th, 1995. Leah Betts was 18 years old. She took a single ecstasy tablet at her birthday party, not in a club, not at a warehouse rave, but at her parents' house, with friends who knew her. Within hours, she was in a coma. 4 days later, she was dead. Her photograph, taken in the hospital, her face swollen beyond recognition, connected to a breathing tube, was used in a national anti-drug campaign that ran on billboards across the UK. The caption read, "Sorted. Just one ecstasy tablet killed Leah Betts." The caption was wrong. The post-mortem found no toxic concentration of MDMA in her system. What killed Leah Betts was hyponatremia, a catastrophic drop in blood sodium caused by drinking approximately 7 litres of water in 90 minutes. She had heard, through the anti-drug messaging circulating in British schools at the time, that ecstasy caused dangerous overheating and dehydration. The advice being passed through peer networks was to drink water, drink a lot of it, keep drinking. The advice was not wrong exactly. Overheating was a real risk in crowded clubs with poor ventilation. But the guidance had no upper limit, no instruction about the danger on the other side, and Leah Betts had followed it with fatal precision in a setting where overheating was not actually occurring. The real danger MDMA had exposed was not on the billboard. The billboard stayed up. The campaign ran for 2 years. An entire generation of British young people learned that ecstasy killed through a story that was, at its mechanistic core, a story about a public health messaging failure, about advice given without enough specificity, about a risk profile presented in 1 dimension when it existed in 3. The lesson that might have saved lives: drink water, but not too much, understand the specific conditions that create danger, was not the lesson the campaign taught. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, something was happening that would connect, through a chain of criminal enterprise and geopolitical accident, directly to the warehouse in South Tel Aviv, where Noa Shalev would stand 15 years later, with her eyes closed and her arms loose at her sides. Dutch chemists had discovered that MDMA was not particularly difficult to synthesize at industrial scale, if the precursor chemicals were available, and in the Netherlands they were. The country's liberal chemical import regulations and dense pharmaceutical infrastructure had made it the unlikely centre of global MDMA production by the early 1990s. The laboratories were real buildings in real industrial parks in cities like Rotterdam and Eindhoven, not hidden operations but semi-concealed ones, operating in the specific grey zone that exists when a crime is too large and too diffuse for the available enforcement apparatus to address directly. The Dutch labs needed customers. They needed distribution networks that could move product across borders without triggering the customs interdiction systems that were, by the mid-1990s, specifically calibrated for European routes. Someone, somewhere, had a solution. The solution came from a community that had arrived in Israel in enormous numbers during the previous decade, carrying, along with their luggage and their Soviet-era survival instincts, a set of skills and connections that would prove precisely suited to the problem the Dutch labs needed solved. The wave of post-Soviet immigration to Israel in the 1990s had brought more than 1 million people in under a decade. Most of them came legally, under Israel's law of return, and most of them rebuilt their lives through legitimate labour. But within that wave, as within any mass migration, There were people whose previous lives had given them expertise in operating outside institutional frameworks, in the specific practical knowledge of how to move things across borders that didn't want those things moved. Some of them found the Dutch labs, and what happened when they did would turn Israel from a destination market into something the DEA had never seen before in the history of the global drug trade. The question was not whether the network would form. The question, the one nobody in Israeli law enforcement or intelligence was asking loudly enough in the mid-1990s, was whether anyone in a position to stop it was actually trying to. The answer to that question was more complicated than a simple no. It was, in fact, the most unsettling answer possible. The Israeli rave scene did not arrive from nowhere. It arrived from Goa. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a specific migration pattern connected the Israeli military discharge to the Indian subcontinent with a directness that, once established, became self-perpetuating. Young Israelis finishing their mandatory service, 3 years for men, 2 for women, years spent inside a structure of total institutional control, had developed a particular hunger for the opposite of everything the army represented. Goa, the former Portuguese colony on India's western coast, offered it. Beaches, cheap accommodation, a trance music scene that had grown from the same Ibiza to world pipeline that was simultaneously flooding Britain, and a chemical culture built almost entirely around MDMA and LSD that had been operating openly enough for long enough that it had developed its own customs and vocabulary. Tens of thousands of Israeli post-service travellers moved through Goa during this period. They called it the trip, both meanings active simultaneously. They came for months, some for years. They built informal communities on the beaches at Anjuna and Arambol, learned the music, learned the culture, and then came home carrying both. What they carried home landed in Tel Aviv with specific force. The city was already changing. The Oslo Accords in 1993 had produced, briefly, something resembling regional optimism, a loosening of the permanent tension that shaped Israeli daily life, an opening toward the possibility of normalcy that expressed itself, as such openings often do, in nightlife. Tel Aviv's club scene expanded rapidly through the mid-1990s. Venues that had operated as bars became clubs. Warehouses in the southern industrial districts, Florentine, the port area, the edges of Jaffa, began hosting events that drew crowds measured in thousands rather than hundreds. The music the returning Goa travellers brought with them, Goa trance, its descendant psytrance, the harder electronic forms evolving in parallel in Europe, found an audience that was not merely receptive but structurally primed. MDMA was the connective tissue of all of it. The early Israeli rave scene's relationship with the substance was, in its first years, roughly similar to the British experience a decade earlier. Widespread, enthusiastic, and sourced through supply chains that were improvised, inconsistent, and largely domestic in scale. Pills moved through personal networks. Purity varied enormously. The infrastructure was informal because the scene itself was informal, a collection of parties rather than an industry, a culture rather than a market. That changed when the Soviet immigrants arrived in the distribution networks. The wave of post-Soviet immigration, over 1 million people between 1990 and 2000, the largest per-capita immigration event in Israeli history, had transformed the country's demographics, its economy, its politics, and, in ways that took years to become visible, its criminal landscape. Among the arrivals were people with backgrounds in the Soviet black market economy, people for whom the navigation of unofficial systems was not a skill learned in desperation, but a professional competency developed over careers. They understood how to move goods across borders without documentation. They understood how to build trust networks in the absence of legal enforcement mechanisms. They understood, with a precision that Western criminal enterprises often lacked, the geography of institutional weakness, where the border was thin, where the customs officer was underpaid, where the inspection was cursory. By the mid-1990s, several of these networks had made contact with Dutch MDMA producers. The connection, when it formed, was almost structurally inevitable. The Dutch labs had product and needed distribution beyond European routes, which were becoming increasingly monitored. The Israeli networks had distribution capacity and a specific logistical advantage that no other criminal organization in Europe possessed. El Al, Israel's national airline, operated under security protocols that were, and remain, the most stringent of any commercial carrier in the world. El Al cargo was subjected to thorough Israeli security screening, but that screening was calibrated for explosives and weapons, not for pills concealed within legitimate commercial shipments. More importantly, El Al cargo moving from Amsterdam's Schiphol airport to Ben Gurion carried a security profile that made Dutch customs less likely to subject it to the secondary inspection that was becoming standard for other routes flagged as MDMA distribution channels. The pills moved in hollowed books, in false-bottomed luggage, inside legitimate diamond shipments, a detail that had a specific logic because the Antwerp to Tel Aviv diamond trade was one of the highest volume, most legally protected commercial corridors in Europe, and its documentation requirements, while thorough on paper, created enough transactional complexity to conceal additional cargo if the concealment was sophisticated. The diamond corridor was not incidental. It was the architecture. By 1999, the DEA's International Operations Division had identified what its internal reports called an Israeli organized crime nexus in global MDMA trafficking. The language was careful. The reports acknowledged that the networks operated from multiple countries and involved individuals of various nationalities, but the structural center of gravity was Israeli. A 2001 congressional testimony by the DEA's Chief of Operations stated explicitly that Israeli trafficking organizations were responsible for the distribution of the majority of MDMA consumed in the United States at that time. Not a plurality, the majority. Interpol's parallel analysis reached a similar conclusion through different data sources. Israeli criminal networks controlled an estimated 75% of global MDMA distribution at the market's peak in the early 2000s. 75% of a global market. The country of 9 million people that was consuming more MDMA per capita than any other nation was simultaneously supplying most of the world's supply. The same networks that ran product from Amsterdam to New York also ran product from Amsterdam to Tel Aviv. The supplier and the primary domestic market were, in the most literal structural sense, the same organization. This was not a coincidence of geography. It was a business model. In 2003, an internal IDF report, classified immediately upon completion, not declassified until portions were leaked to an Israeli investigative journalist 12 years later, documented MDMA use rates among combat soldiers on leave in Tel Aviv at levels that alarmed the officers who commissioned the study. The numbers have never been fully published. What the journalist who obtained the partial leak reported was that the rate of MDMA use among IDF combat soldiers on weekend leave in Tel Aviv was more than double the rate found in the equivalent age demographic in the United Kingdom, at the time considered the highest in Europe. The report was classified. It did not generate a policy response. Noah Shalev did not know this report existed. In 2017, she was 24 years old, 2 years out of her service, working in a product management role at a mid-sized tech startup in the Rothschild Boulevard corridor, the area the international press had taken to calling Silicon Wadi. She was good at her job. She arrived on time. Her code reviews were thorough and her presentations were clear. Her manager, in a performance review that spring, described her as exceptionally functional under pressure. Functional was the word she had heard most often since discharge. She used it about herself. It was accurate and it was incomplete in equal measure. By 2017, her MDMA use had settled into a pattern she considered, and by most clinical definitions technically was, recreational, every second or third weekend, at parties or smaller gatherings, with people she trusted. 6 weeks between uses, sometimes. 5 weeks, often. The 6 to 8 week threshold that separated full neurological recovery from compounding depletion was not something she'd been told about, and not something she had encountered in the harm reduction literature she had not sought out. The concept did not exist in the cultural framework through which she understood what she was doing. What she understood was that the weekends with MDMA felt like herself, and the weekdays without it felt like a slightly muted version of herself, and that the distance between the two states was not alarming enough to examine directly. She owned a small shelf of books she had not finished. She had a gym membership she used inconsistently. She kept a plant on her windowsill, a succulent, chosen specifically because it required almost no attention, and checked it each morning as she left for work with an expression that a person watching might have identified as something between affection and guilt, without being able to say precisely which. The plant was fine. She watered it on Sundays. Somewhere in the network that supplied her, through friends of people she had never met, through a chain of transactions that connected her apartment in South Tel Aviv to a laboratory in the Dutch city of Eindhoven, through at least 6 intermediary steps, was a man named Yevgeny Borowski. Borowski was 47 years old, originally from Dnepropetrovsk in eastern Ukraine, Israeli citizen since 1994. He had arrived with a degree in industrial chemistry from a Soviet university and had spent his first 5 years in Israel working legitimately in a plastics manufacturing plant in the Negev. He left that job in 1999. What he had done between 1999 and 2003 was not fully documented in any public record. What was documented, in sealed indictment files that would not become partially public for another decade, was that by 2003 he was a mid-level coordinator in one of the distribution networks the DEA had identified in its congressional testimony. He had never met Noa Shalev. He didn't know her name. The chain between his operation and her apartment was long enough that neither would ever be legally connected. But the pill she swallowed on a Friday night in October 2017, white, unmarked, slightly chalky, purchased for 80 shekels from a person whose name she knew only by a nickname, had travelled from a Dutch laboratory, through Borowski's network, through 3 further handlers, into a small plastic bag in a stranger's jacket pocket, and then into her hand. She did not think about any of this. Why would she? Nobody in that chain thought about the end of it. What nobody in any position of authority, not Israeli law enforcement, not the IDF, not the health ministry, was prepared to publicly acknowledge was the question of who else knew. The trafficking networks were not invisible. They had been identified, documented, described in DEA congressional testimony and Interpol circulars, discussed in closed security briefings at multiple levels of the Israeli government. The networks operated in the specific space between what was known and what was acted upon. That space was not empty. Something occupied it, and the nature of what occupied it, the reason the gap between knowledge and action was so precisely maintained for so long, was the thing that would not become clear until documents surfaced that nobody was supposed to see. Yevgeny Borowski knew something about that gap. He had reason to. He had, on 3 occasions between 2001 and 2006, received phone calls from a number that, when traced years later by a journalist using leaked records, resolved to an exchange associated with Israeli internal security services. He had answered those calls. He had provided what was asked for, and in return the documentation suggests certain things had not happened to him that might otherwise have happened. The calls, the records, the resolution, none of that was public in 2017 when Noah swallowed the pill. But it was already there, in sealed files and classified briefings and the specific institutional memory of people who had decided, for reasons that made a certain operational sense, and a different kind of sense entirely, to let the network run. The phone calls to Yevgeny Borowski were not an accident of bureaucracy. They were a policy, not a written policy. Nothing in the files that eventually surfaced described what happened as a program or an initiative or a directive. What the documents described in the careful language of internal operational memos was a series of individual decisions made by individual handlers within Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, each decision locally justified, each one building on the previous one, until the accumulated weight of those decisions constituted something that functioned exactly like a policy without ever having been authorized as one. The logic was straightforward, and in its own operational terms not irrational. By the late 1990s, Shin Bet had identified that several of the major MDMA distribution networks operating out of Israel had overlapping membership with communities the service was monitoring for other reasons entirely, specifically for connections to organized crime structures with potential links to terrorist financing in the former Soviet states. The networks moved money as well as pills. The money moved through channels that were, from an intelligence perspective, extraordinarily useful to observe. Disrupting the network meant losing the channel. Losing the channel meant losing visibility into money flows that the service considered a national security priority. So the networks were not disrupted. They were observed. Their key nodes, people like Borowski, mid-level coordinators who knew enough to be useful but not enough to be indispensable, were cultivated as informants. They received, in exchange for periodic intelligence on money movements and organizational structure, a form of operational protection that never appeared in writing, but was understood by everyone involved with the clarity of a contract. The MDMA kept moving. The intelligence kept flowing. The arrangement persisted for years. This pattern, a security service allowing a criminal network to operate in exchange for intelligence value, was not unique to Israel. The DEA had done versions of it in Latin America. MI5 had done versions of it in Northern Ireland. The practice had a long, documented, morally complex history in the tradecraft of every major intelligence service in the world. What made the Israeli case specific was its scale, its duration, and the particular substance involved, because MDMA, unlike cocaine or heroin, was flowing primarily into the domestic population. The intelligence dividend was international. The public health cost was internal. The people bearing the cost were Israeli citizens in their 20s and 30s. People like Noah Shalev. She did not know any of this in the spring of 2018 when she sat in the emergency room at Ichilov Hospital in Tel Aviv at 4 a.m. on a Sunday morning, waiting for a nurse to check her blood pressure for the third time in an hour. She had not been brought in by ambulance. She had taken a taxi, alone, after regaining consciousness on the bathroom floor of an apartment in Florentine where she'd been at a party the night before. The loss of consciousness had lasted, she estimated, somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes. Nobody at the party had noticed immediately because the music was loud, and the bathroom door was not the kind that locked. She had taken one pill, a standard dose, she believed, of a substance she had been using for 3 years without incident. What the emergency room blood work showed was not a toxic overdose. It showed a sodium level at the low edge of concerning and a serotonin metabolite profile that the attending physician described in her notes as consistent with a person who had not allowed adequate recovery time between recent uses. The physician asked Noah when she had last used MDMA before that night. Noah said 3 weeks. The physician wrote the answer down without reaction. 3 weeks was not 6. It was not 8. The reserves had not fully rebuilt. The body had simply run out of something it needed, and the running out had expressed itself on a bathroom floor at 3 a.m. Noah told nobody about the hospital visit. Not her roommate, not her mother in Ramat Gan, not the colleague at work who occasionally attended the same parties. She filed it in the same internal category where she kept the things that had come back from her service, as something that had happened, was over, and did not require further examination. She was wrong about the last part, but she didn't know that yet. What was happening simultaneously in a research building at Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba was something Noah would not learn about for years, something that existed in complete institutional separation from the emergency room at Ichilov, from Shin Bet's operational files, from the DEA's congressional testimony, and yet connected to all of them in ways that, once visible, made the entire picture look different from every angle. Professor Irita Kirav had been studying the neuroscience of trauma and memory at Ben Gurion since 2005. Her work focused on the endocannabinoid system initially, but by 2012 she had expanded her research to examine how various compounds affected fear memory consolidation, the process by which traumatic experiences become encoded in the brain as persistent, intrusive memories. Her laboratory's findings on MDMA's effect on this process were, by 2015, producing results significant enough that she was in regular correspondence with researchers at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, the California-based nonprofit that had been fighting since 1986 to restore legal therapeutic access to MDMA. MAPS had been founded the same year MDMA was permanently scheduled. Its founder, Rick Doblin, had written his doctoral dissertation on the politics of the scheduling decision, and had spent the 3 decades since navigating the specific bureaucratic labyrinth that Schedule I created for research, applying for DEA licenses to study a Schedule I substance, obtaining FDA approval for human trials, funding studies through donations because no pharmaceutical company would touch a compound it could not patent. By 2017, the MAPS clinical trials for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD were in Phase 3, the final stage before FDA review. The results being generated were, by the standards of psychiatric research, extraordinary. Participants with treatment-resistant PTSD, people who had failed multiple rounds of conventional therapy and medication, were showing remission rates above 60% after 3 sessions. The control group, receiving therapy without MDMA, showed remission rates of 30%. The difference was not subtle. Israeli researchers, including members of Akirav's team, were contributing data to this international effort. Here was the contradiction that no Israeli government official ever addressed publicly, because addressing it would have required acknowledging both sides simultaneously. The same country whose security services had allowed MDMA trafficking networks to operate for years, whose citizens were consuming the substance at the highest per capita rate on Earth, was simultaneously running some of the world's most advanced and most promising research into MDMA's therapeutic applications. The therapeutic researchers and the public health crisis occupied the same geography and never officially touched. The scientist in Beersheba knew about the crisis in Tel Aviv in the way that any citizen knew about it, from news reports, from social conversations, from the ambient awareness of living in a small country where information travelled fast. They did not have access to the Shin Bet operational files. They did not know about Borowski. They were doing science in a box that had been deliberately kept separate from the policy environment that had created the conditions their science was trying to address. The irony had a specific shape. The government that had tolerated the supply network that fed the crisis was simultaneously funding, Through university grants and research infrastructure, the scientific effort most likely to produce a legitimate therapeutic framework for the substance at the center of that crisis. Left hand, right hand, the same body, facing opposite directions. Noah Shalev was not thinking about any of this in the weeks after her hospital visit. She was thinking about whether to use again. The question occupied a specific corner of her mind that she was careful not to look at directly, the way a person in a room with a broken window learns to sit facing the other wall. The decision she eventually made was not dramatic. She waited 5 weeks, attended a party in Jaffa, and took half a dose instead of a full one. Half felt like almost nothing. The gap between half and nothing was narrowing, and the narrowing was the thing she had not been warned about and could not yet name. Her emotional range on ordinary days had been contracting so gradually that she had attributed it to work pressure, to the particular grey stretch of a Tel Aviv February, to the general condition of being 25 in a city that moved very fast and rewarded people who did not slow down to examine themselves too carefully. What she hadn't attributed it to was chemistry, to the specific, measurable, now documented process by which repeated MDMA used below recovery thresholds alters the density of serotonin receptors in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for emotional regulation, for the experience of ordinary pleasure, for the capacity to find Tuesday afternoon in a reasonably good job in a reasonably comfortable city sufficient. The receptor changes were not permanent at her stage of use. The research was clear on this. With adequate abstinence, receptor density recovered. But the research was also clear that the recovery required abstinence measured in months, not weeks, and that continuing to use while the receptors were already depleted accelerated the process in ways that were difficult to reverse on the same timeline. Nobody had told her this. Not because the information didn't exist. It did in peer-reviewed literature, in MAPS harm reduction guidelines, in the documentation of researchers like Akirav, whose work was producing exactly this data. But the information existed in journals and clinical settings, and harm reduction pamphlets distributed at festivals to people who were already past the point of finding them useful. The infrastructure that might have delivered this information to Noah Shalev before it was relevant, before her first use, or during the years when the pattern was forming, was not absent in Israel. It was something more complicated than absent. It was present, sophisticated, and systematically underfunded in exactly the areas that would have mattered most. Israel's harm reduction infrastructure had been developing since the early 2000s, partly in response to the same public health data that was alarming the health ministry, and partly through the efforts of NGOs that had watched the British experience and drawn specific lessons from it. Organisations like TRIP, which deployed trained volunteers to music festivals, operated a hotline for people in distress, and distributed pill testing kits that allowed users to verify what they were actually taking, were, by 2015, among the most sophisticated harm reduction operations in the Middle East. The pill testing kits were significant, because what Israeli harm reduction workers were finding when they tested pills at festivals was not reassuring. In samples tested at major events between 2015 and 2018, MDMA purity ranged from 40% to 92%, with no correlation between the pill's appearance and its actual content. Pills sold as MDMA contained in some cases no MDMA at all, substituted with other compounds that produce superficially similar effects, but with different risk profiles. Pills sold at modest doses sometimes contain 2 or 3 times the expected quantity. The variability itself was the danger. A user calibrating their dose based on previous experience had no reliable way to apply that calibration to a new pill from a new source. Every purchase was, neurologically speaking, a controlled experiment with an unknown variable. This was the direct consequence of an unregulated supply chain, the consequence of the scheduling decision that John Lorne had made in 1988, overruling his own judge, the consequence of the operational choice that had kept the distribution networks running. Every link in the chain, from Darmstadt in 1912 to a festival in the Negev in 2017, had contributed to the specific moment when a person bought a pill from a stranger and had no mechanism to know what was in it. The government knew this. The harm reduction workers had submitted reports. The health ministry had received the festival testing data. A 2017 internal briefing, obtained years later through a Freedom of Information request by an Israeli journalist named Tamar Friedman, showed that senior health ministry officials had been presented with comprehensive data on MDMA purity variability at Israeli events and had recommended internally an expansion of legal pill testing services. The recommendation was approved in committee. Its implementation was delayed pending interdepartmental coordination. The coordination meeting was scheduled for April 2018. 3 young Israelis died at music events in the summer of 2018 before that meeting produced any operational change. The first death was in June at a psytrance festival in the north. The second was in July at a private event in Tel Aviv. The third was in August at Midburn, Israel's version of Burning Man, held in the Negev desert, attended by thousands, operating with the specific utopian self-governance ethic of the global Burning Man movement and the specific medical limitations of a remote desert location. 3 deaths, 1 summer, a country of 9 million people. The number sounds small. In public health terms, it was not small. It was a rate that, scaled to population, represented a crisis by the metrics used by the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction. More importantly, it was 3 specific people with names and families and the particular irreversibility of the dead, and their deaths arrived at a moment when the government's internal documentation showed clearly that the risks had been known, quantified, and administratively delayed. The press covered all 3 deaths. Tamar Friedman, the journalist who would later obtain the health ministry briefing, published a piece after the 3rd death that laid out the timeline with a precision that made the delay visible as a decision rather than a failure. Her editors ran it on the front page. The government's response came within 6 weeks. It was not what anyone had predicted. It was not tougher enforcement. It was not a new prosecution initiative targeting the distribution networks that had been operating with effective impunity for 15 years. It was not a statement from the Prime Minister about the drug crisis facing Israeli youth. It was a formal policy expansion of harm reduction services, an official government authorization of pill testing at licensed music events, an increase in funding for organizations like TRIP, a directive to the Health Ministry to develop educational materials about MDMA risk profiles that were specific, accurate, and did not rely on the kind of simplified anti-drug messaging that had killed Leah Betts in Essex in 1995. The government had looked at 3 deaths and concluded that it could not stop the use. It could only try to make the use less lethal. That decision, buried in a health ministry press release that most Israeli newspapers covered on page 7, was a policy revolution dressed in administrative language. It was the state acknowledging, in the only way states acknowledge things without saying them, that the war against MDMA on Israeli soil was over. Had been over for years, perhaps had never, given what Shin Bet's files contained, been seriously fought. Noah Shalev did not read the press release. She read about the 3rd death, the one at Midburn, in a news alert on her phone on a Tuesday morning on the bus to work, her thumb scrolling past it before she had fully processed what it said, the way the brain protects itself from information that lands too close to home. She was 25 years old. She'd been to Midburn the previous year. She put her phone in her bag and watched the city move past the bus window, and did not think about it again until that night. when she lay in bed unable to sleep and found herself calculating without meaning to how many times she'd taken a pill from a source she could not fully verify. The number was large enough that she stopped counting before she finished. Somewhere in a research building in Beersheba, the data from the latest MAPS trial was being analysed. Somewhere in a sealed archive, Shin Bet's operational files sat in a room that had a specific level of security clearance attached to it. Somewhere in the Netherlands, the supply chain that connected to her was running its ordinary operations, untouched and uninterrupted, its key nodes protected by arrangements that had outlasted every public health crisis they had contributed to. And somewhere in a health ministry office in Jerusalem, a bureaucrat was drafting the implementation guidelines for the new harm reduction policy. Guidelines that would arrive with a particular timing of institutional response, approximately 4 years after they would have mattered most to the specific people they were designed to protect. The data that was about to emerge from Tel Aviv University would make all of this impossible to ignore. Not for the government, not for the researchers, not for anyone who read the number that a team of neuroscientists was, at that precise moment, in the process of confirming. The number concerned what regular MDMA use at sub-recovery intervals did to a specific type of receptor in the human brain. The number was not theoretical. It had been measured in living subjects with imaging technology precise enough to see the damage directly. And the damage, once seen, could not be unseen. The study landed in January 2019, and the researchers who produced it had spent 3 years hoping they were wrong. The team at Tel Aviv University's Segal School of Neuroscience had used PET imaging, positron emission tomography, a scanning technology that measures metabolic activity in living tissue with enough resolution to count, effectively, the functional density of specific receptor types in specific brain regions. They had recruited 75 subjects, 25 who had used MDMA regularly for at least 2 years with intervals between uses of 6 weeks or less, 25 who had used it occasionally with adequate recovery intervals, and 25 who had never used it. All 3 groups were matched for age, sex, baseline mental health status, and alcohol and cannabis use. The study design was rigorous enough that the peer review process, usually a source of delay, moved quickly. What the scan showed in the regular use group was a reduction in 5-HT2A receptor density, serotonin receptors, specifically the subtype most involved in emotional processing, and the experience of ordinary reward, averaging 23% below the never-use control group, not 23% below peak MDMA experience, 23% below baseline, below what a person who had never taken the drug registered as their ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday afternoon level of emotional availability. The occasional use group showed no statistically significant difference from the control group. The variable that separated the 2 groups was not the total number of uses, it was the interval. The 6 to 8 week recovery threshold that researchers had identified theoretically years earlier was now visible in brain scans, a measurable anatomical line between recovery and accumulating damage, photographed in the tissue of living people. The lead researcher, Dr. Ronit Segev, presented the findings at a conference in Tel Aviv in February 2019. She'd given academic presentations for 20 years. She described this one differently afterward, not in any written record, but to colleagues who were present, who later recounted that she had paused twice during the presentation in a way that she didn't usually pause, not for effect, for a different reason. The conference was attended by health ministry officials, harm reduction workers, and representatives from the IDF's medical corps. The data was not disputed. The methodology was not challenged. The room was very quiet during the receptor density slides. The average interval between MDMA uses in the regular use study group was 4.3 weeks. A national survey published in the same month, conducted by the Israel Anti-Drug Authority using anonymous self-reporting from 6,000 adults aged 18 to 35, found that among Israelis who used MDMA regularly, the median interval between uses was 3.8 weeks. The study subjects were not outliers, they were the median, which meant the 23% receptor density reduction was not a finding about heavy users on the extreme end of a distribution. It was a finding about ordinary, functional, employed, socially integrated Israeli adults in their 20s and 30s, people who showed up to work on Monday, who paid their rent, who described their use as recreational and manageable and under control. The damage the scans were documenting was happening inside the specific population that Israeli public health discourse had consistently failed to recognize as a population at risk, precisely because that population looked from the outside like it was fine. Noah Shalev was 26 years old in January 2019. She did not read the study. She had stopped reading news with particular attention several months earlier in a shift she noticed but did not interrogate. Her concentration at work was intact. The professional skills that had made her effective in her job operated on different neural infrastructure than the serotonin system being documented in the scans, and they had not yet been meaningfully affected. What had changed was subtler. The pleasure she took in things she had previously enjoyed, a specific playlist she had listened to obsessively at 23, the particular satisfaction of finishing a project cleanly, the warmth she used to feel automatically when a close friend called unexpectedly, had not disappeared. It had become quieter, fainter, like a signal reaching her from slightly farther away than it used to. She added a second plant to her windowsill in February, a small fern that required more attention than the succulent. She wasn't sure why she bought it. The ecosystem that had grown around MDMA in Tel Aviv by 2019 was, by any cultural measure, extraordinary in its density and its sophistication. The warehouse scene in Florentine and the surrounding neighbourhoods had developed its own geography, regular venues, known promoters, a calendar of events that circulated through encrypted group chats with the reliability of a listings magazine. Midburn drew 15,000 people to the Negev each year, a temporary city with its own infrastructure, its own medical services, its own harm reduction volunteers who walk the grounds at night, wearing orange vests and carrying water and testing kits. The Citrance festivals that ran through the warmer months at kibbutzim in northern forests on beaches, each had their own character, but shared the same chemical centre of gravity. Tel Aviv's mainstream nightlife had absorbed MDMA so thoroughly that the distinction between the underground rave scene and the ordinary club scene had become largely one of music genre rather than substance. Surveys conducted by the Israel Anti-Drug Authority found MDMA use reported at rates above 40% among regular Tel Aviv nightlife attendees aged 22 to 32. Not lifetime use, current, ongoing use. The demographic profile of Israeli MDMA users was the detail that most consistently surprised international researchers encountering the data for the first time. It was not the profile that drug policy frameworks were built to address. It was not economically marginalized youth in underserved communities, the population that anti-drug infrastructure in most countries was designed around. Israeli MDMA users were disproportionately educated, university graduates at higher rates than the general population. They were employed, predominantly in the tech and creative sectors that drove Tel Aviv's economy. Their household incomes were above average. Their social integration was high. They had doctors and gym memberships and plants on their windowsills. The policy apparatus had no template for this population, because the template had been written for a different story entirely. The 3 deaths in the summer of 2018 had produced the government's harm reduction expansion. What they had not produced was any structural engagement with the question of why Israel specifically had arrived at this point, why the per capita numbers were what they were, what the supply chain looked like at its source, what the relationship between the trafficking networks and the security apparatus actually was. These questions existed in compartments that the post-deaths policy response did not open. Then, in March 2019, Tamar Friedman published a second piece. The first piece, after the Midburn death, had laid out the health ministry's timeline and made the delay visible. The second piece was different in kind. Friedman had spent 8 months obtaining documents through Freedom of Information requests, leaked sources within the security establishment, and cross-referencing court records from sealed prosecutions that had become partially accessible through the appeals process. What she published was not a complete picture. She said so explicitly in the piece's opening paragraph, a concession to the gaps in the documentation that also functioned as a signal to readers about what the complete picture might contain. What she published was enough. The piece documented with specific dates and traceable sources that Israeli security services had maintained informant relationships with individuals inside the major MDMA distribution networks for periods extending back to the late 1990s. It documented that at least 2 prosecutions of mid-level network figures had been suspended at the request of an unnamed security body. It documented that a 2006 internal review within the Israel police had flagged the operational protection of network informants as a factor in the persistence of the distribution infrastructure, and that the review's recommendations had been sent to a coordinating body that included Shin Bet representation and had not produced any documented response. The piece named no serving intelligence officers. It named no specific informants. It was careful in its claims and precise in its sourcing. It was, by the standards of Israeli investigative journalism, an extraordinary piece of work. It generated 2 days of significant coverage. A Knesset member from the opposition submitted a written question to the relevant minister. The minister's office responded that security matters could not be discussed in open session. The question was referred to the Knesset's Intelligence Subcommittee, which met in closed session and produced no public statement. The coverage moved on to other things. Friedman's piece remained online, read by people who sought it out, cited occasionally in academic papers, referenced in harm reduction training materials as context. It didn't produce a commission, a public inquiry, or any formal institutional reckoning with what it documented. The networks continued to operate. Noah Shalev continued to use, at intervals that had, by early 2019, contracted to roughly 3 weeks, though she didn't track it precisely because tracking it precisely would have required acknowledging what the tracking would show. She was, in the clinical language she did not yet have access to, in the early stages of a use pattern that the research distinguished from addiction not in kind but in degree, a distinction that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in practice. The specific signal was not craving in the way the word was usually used, not a desperate physical need that made ordinary functioning impossible. It was subtler and, in some ways, harder to address. It was the anticipation of the weekend, the particular orientation of the whole week toward Friday night, the way Monday through Thursday had become a kind of anteroom. The thing she was waiting for was not just the substance, it was the version of herself the substance restored, the one who felt things at the volume they were supposed to be felt at, the one who could sit across from a person she cared about and be fully present rather than partially translated. She could not reliably access that version of herself without the chemical anymore. She was not certain when that had changed. Looking back, she could not identify a specific week where the line had been crossed, only the recognition, arriving slowly and then all at once, that the crossing had already happened. In June 2019, at a party in an apartment in Neve Tzedek, Noah Shalev took MDMA and spent an hour in a bathroom staring at her own face in the mirror with the lights on, not in distress, or not only in distress. in a kind of suspended clarity that felt like being held very still in a moment that was too precise to move through quickly. She looked at her own face and understood, without finding words for it immediately, that she was looking at something she did not fully recognize. She was 26 years old. The fern on her windowsill had died 2 weeks earlier from overwatering. She hadn't noticed it declining until it was already gone. The National Survey data for 2019, published in October of that year, was the document that finally made the scale impossible for Israeli public health authorities to continue processing as a manageable concern. The wastewater analysis, the hospital data, the self-report survey, all three methodologies converged on the same conclusion, with a consistency that removed the usual statistical retreat of methodological uncertainty. Israel's per-capita MDMA consumption was not only the highest in the world, it had increased by 34% in 3 years. The health officials who received the report in their offices in Jerusalem read it with the specific expression of people who have been watching a number rise for years and have hoped, each quarter, that the current reading would be the one that began to reverse. It was not that reading, it was not close to that reading. Something had to change. The question was what, and whether the thing that needed to change was the kind of thing that governments, operating within the constraints of what they had already decided and what they had already protected, were capable of changing. The answer was forming in a laboratory in California, in the FDA's review offices in Washington, and in a specific moment that was approaching, a moment in which MDMA's therapeutic promise and its public health crisis would arrive at the same institutional doorstep simultaneously, demanding a response that the system had spent 40 years building itself to be unable to give. The FDA's breakthrough therapy designation arrived in 2021 like a door opening in a wall that had been sealed for 40 years. The designation, a regulatory classification reserved for treatments showing substantial improvement over existing options for serious conditions, did not legalize MDMA. It did not restore the therapeutic networks that had gone underground in 1985. What it did was signal that the FDA considered the MAPS Phase 3 trial data serious enough to warrant expedited review, a fast-track process that acknowledged the existing treatments for PTSD were, for a significant percentage of patients, inadequate. The researchers who had spent careers navigating the Schedule 1 labyrinth received the news with a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from having been right for a very long time in an environment that punished being right. Rick Doblin, who had founded MAPS the same year John Lorne overruled his own judge, had been working toward this moment for 35 years. He was 67 years old when the designation came through. He had filed the paperwork for MAP's first DEA research license in 1986, the year the ink was still drying on the permanent scheduling order. The gap between those two dates, 1986 and 2021, contained everything. The underground therapists, the British summers, the Dutch laboratories, the Israeli trafficking networks, the Shin Bet files, the wastewater surveys, the deaths at Midburn, the Tel Aviv University scans, the 23%. The FDA approval application was submitted in late 2023. What happened next was not what the researchers expected. It was not what anyone who had followed the trial data expected. In August 2024, the FDA rejected the application. The rejection was not a dismissal of the therapeutic potential. The agency's written response acknowledged the effect sizes in the trial data, the 67% remission rate in treatment-resistant PTSD patients, as clinically meaningful. What it cited instead were concerns about trial design, specifically the difficulty of maintaining a proper blind in a study where the active treatment produced effects that participants could clearly identify, and questions about whether the functional unblinding had introduced bias into therapist assessments. the FDA requested additional trial data addressing these methodological concerns before the application could be resubmitted. The researchers read the rejection letter with the specific expression of people who had anticipated every possible objection for 3 decades except the one that arrived. The methodological critique was not invented. The blinding problem in psychedelic research was real and had been discussed extensively in the literature, both by MAPS researchers themselves and by critics of the trials. A participant who could feel whether they had received MDMA or a placebo was a participant who could not be fully blinded, and a therapist observing an unblinded participant could, consciously or not, calibrate their assessments accordingly. The critique was legitimate. The question of what to do with a legitimate critique of a methodology that had no clean solution, because there was no way to make MDMA imperceptible to someone who had taken it, that question had no answer the FDA's existing framework was built to accommodate. The door that had opened in 2021 had not closed, but it had not opened further. In Israel, the response to the FDA rejection was muted in official channels and loud in research ones. The scientists who had contributed data to the MAPS trials understood immediately that the rejection extended the timeline by years. Additional trials, additional FDA engagement, additional navigation of a regulatory process that had been designed for compounds that behaved differently than MDMA behaved. Professor Akirav's team at Ben-Gurion, whose work on trauma memory had fed into the broader evidence base, published a commentary in a peer-reviewed journal noting that the rejection left a specific population, treatment-resistant PTSD patients who had exhausted conventional options, without access to the only intervention the clinical data consistently showed working for them. That population, in Israel, was not abstract. The IDF's mental health division had been tracking PTSD rates in combat veterans since the Second Lebanon War in 2006. The numbers had never been published in their full form. What had been published, in partial disclosures and academic papers using IDF data, was enough to establish that the rate of treatment-resistant PTSD among Israeli combat veterans was significantly higher than the rates that NATO militaries reported, a difference attributed by researchers to the particular nature of Israel's security situation, the frequency of conflict cycles, and the absence of adequate decompression time between operational deployment and return to civilian life. These were the people the MAPS trials had been most consistently helping. These were the people the FDA rejection had most directly affected. And these were the people who, in the absence of a legal therapeutic framework, were most likely to find the compound through the same informal networks that had been operating since the 1990s, taking it without clinical supervision, without integration support, without the structured therapeutic container that made the difference, in the trial data, between a healing experience and an overwhelming one. The circular logic had completed itself. The criminalization that was supposed to protect people from the compound was driving those people toward the compound's most dangerous form of use. Noah Shalev stopped using MDMA in August 2020. Not dramatically. Not with a crisis point that announced itself as a turning point. She had already had that in the Neve Tzedek bathroom in June 2019 and had continued for another 14 months afterward. What finally stopped her was not a single event, but an accumulation of small recognitions that had been building for months, each one individually deniable, collectively undeniable. The last party she attended before stopping, she spent most of the night sitting in a corner watching other people dance. The substance was working. She could feel the familiar chemical warmth, the loosening of the usual distance between herself and her own experience. But something was different. She watched the faces around her, the specific expression of a crowd in the first hour of MDMA, that quality of open, uncomplicated presence. and felt for the first time that she was watching something from outside it rather than inside it. Not because the drug wasn't working, because she could see, from inside the effect, how much she had needed the effect in order to feel things at a volume that had once been her ordinary baseline. She took a taxi home at 1 a.m. She sat on her bathroom floor, not in distress, not in crisis, just sitting, and stayed there for 20 minutes. Then she got up, washed her face, and went to bed. She did not go to the next party. The weeks that followed were not comfortable. The receptor density research she eventually found, searching online at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, the way people search for things they have been not searching for a long time, described what she was experiencing with a clinical precision that she found simultaneously clarifying and cold. The reduced emotional range, the flatness of ordinary reward, the way a good meal or a conversation with someone she loved registered at a volume that felt like a radio turned down by a third. The research was clear that this was not permanent at her stage of use, that adequate abstinence would allow receptor recovery, that the timeline was months rather than years. It was also clear that continued use during the recovery period would extend the damage, possibly significantly. She did not use again. The months that followed were the longest she'd gone without since 2015. In the spring of 2021, 14 months into her abstinence, she found a support group in Florentia. Not a 12-step program. The Israeli harm reduction philosophy had produced a different model, one that did not require labeling use as addiction or committing to permanent abstinence, but that provided a structured space for people navigating the specific experience of stopping something that had been woven into the fabric of their social and psychological life for years. The group met on Tuesday evenings in a community centre, 2 blocks from the warehouse where, in October 2019, a researcher's survey had found MDMA in the systems of 94% of attendees. The support group facilitator was a woman named Shira Katz, a social worker with a background in harm reduction, who had spent 6 years working with TRIP volunteers at festivals before moving to clinical support work. She did not call what the group members had experienced addiction in the opening session. She called it, in the careful language of someone who had thought about the words very precisely, a relationship with a substance that had met a real need and had cost something real in the meeting of it. Noah Shalev sat in the plastic chair and listened to that sentence and felt something shift in her chest. Not the chemical warmth she'd spent 5 years chasing, but something quieter and more located, something that felt like being accurately described for the first time in a long while. She began attending regularly. Tuesday evenings, 7 o'clock, a room that smelled like the instant coffee from the machine in the hallway, and the particular mustiness of a building that had been many things before it was this. What she described to the group over the following months was not the extremity of her experience. She had not lost a job, had not lost a relationship catastrophically, had not bottomed out in any of the ways that conventional narratives about drug use required. What she described was the subtraction, the narrowing, the way she had lost access to the ordinary texture of her own emotional life so gradually that she had attributed it to everything except its actual cause, to work, to the city, to the general condition of being a person in her mid-20s who had been through things she couldn't talk about and had found one reliable way to feel like herself again. She described feeling, at 26, like she'd put something down that she didn't know how to pick back up without the chemical. She described the specific strangeness of recovering a version of herself that felt simultaneously familiar and distant, like a room she'd lived in before the furniture was rearranged. At 14 months clean, she was sleeping better. Her emotional range was wider than it had been at her lowest point. The faint quality of signal from a distance had not fully resolved, but it had improved measurably. Not in a clinical scan, but in the ordinary daily evidence of finding things funny, of feeling the specific warmth of a phone call from her mother without reaching for it across a gap. She described all of this in the flat, specific language of someone who had been in an intelligence unit and had learned, professionally, to report what was observed rather than what was interpreted. The group listened. Shira Katz took a note. The coffee machine in the hallway made its sound. Outside the community centre, Florentine was doing what Florentine always did on Tuesday evenings, filling up slowly, with people moving toward the later hours. The warehouses in the surrounding streets were not yet open. The music had not yet started. The pills that would circulate later that night had already moved through their distribution chain, were already in jacket pockets and small bags, and the palms of people who did not know or did not think about the sequence of hands they had passed through to arrive there. The MAPS researchers were already designing the additional trials the FDA had requested. The process would take years. The patients who needed the treatment today were not in those trials. They were in the same city as the researchers, navigating the same compound through the same unregulated channels, without the clinical container that made the difference between the two outcomes the data described. Yevgeny Borowski had left Israel in 2021. The leaked records that Tamar Friedman had obtained suggested, without fully documenting, that his departure had been facilitated rather than coincidental. He was living, according to the same records, somewhere in Cyprus. The distribution network he had coordinated had not collapsed with his departure. Networks of that structure did not collapse when individual nodes were removed. They redistributed. They adapted. The product continued to move. The Tel Aviv warehouses continued to fill on Friday nights. The trip volunteers continued to walk the festival grounds in their orange vests. The harm reduction hotline continued to take calls. The health ministry continued to publish its quarterly data. The Knesset's Intelligence Subcommittee continued to meet in closed session. The sealed files continued to sit in rooms with security clearances attached to them. David Weiss, the Vietnam veteran from Marin County, whose case file had sat in Leo Zeff's Oakland cabinet in 1985, was 83 years old. He had not had access to supervised MDMA therapy since the scheduling. He had continued in conventional therapy and had, by his own account relayed through a researcher who had interviewed him for an oral history project, maintained the gains from those 3 sessions across nearly 4 decades, imperfectly, with setbacks, but maintained. He still chose seats in the middle of restaurants. He still had the nightmares, occasionally. He still considered the 3 sessions in 1983 and 1984 the most significant therapeutic experience of his life. He had been waiting since 1985 for the FDA to reach a conclusion he had already reached in a therapy room in Marin County. He was still waiting. The question that the story of MDMA had been generating since 1912, since a German chemist filed a patent on Christmas Eve for a compound he had no particular interest in, was not whether the molecule was dangerous or whether it was therapeutic. The data was unambiguous on both counts. It was both, simultaneously, depending on the conditions of its use. The question was whether the systems human beings had built to manage substances of this kind, the legal frameworks, the regulatory bodies, the security services, the criminal networks, the harm reduction organizations, the pharmaceutical industry, the research institutions, were capable of holding that complexity without collapsing it into something simpler and more manageable and less true. The evidence, accumulated across more than a century, suggested they were not yet. But the trials were ongoing. The files were slowly becoming less sealed. The researchers were still in their buildings. Shira Katz was still running her Tuesday evening group in Florentine, and Noah Shalev was still attending, still reporting what she observed, still recovering something that the chemistry had taken, and that the absence of chemistry was incrementally and without drama returning. What remained unresolved was not one thing, it was a list. The FDA's additional trial requirements with no guaranteed outcome, the trafficking networks with no serious disruption, the veterans with treatment-resistant PTSD with no legal access to the one treatment that consistently worked for them, the institutional contradiction between what the security files contained and what public policy acknowledged, the gap between the damage the Tel Aviv University scans had documented and the support infrastructure available to the people the scans described. The list was long. The pace of its resolution was slow. The cost of its slowness was being paid continuously by people whose names were not in any official document. That cost was still accumulating. The Tuesday evening group met again next week, and the week after, and the week after that, in a room that smelled like instant coffee, 2 blocks from a warehouse that would be full on Friday night. The warehouse had no sign. It still doesn't. The same building, the same street, the same hour. But the crowd inside it looks different now that the story behind it is visible. The faces are not anonymous anymore. They belong to people who came home from somewhere carrying something they were given no tools to put down, who found a molecule that temporarily restored a quality of feeling that should never have been taken from them in the first place, who are operating inside a supply chain built by criminal networks that security services allowed to run, consuming a substance that a German chemist made by accident and a Texas entrepreneur renamed for profit, and a federal administrator banned against his own judge's recommendation, and that a generation of researchers spent 40 years trying to return to the people it could have helped. The base presses against the walls, the lights come in pulses. 4,000 people move inside a building that to anyone passing on the street at 3 a.m. looks like nothing in particular. A shuttered industrial unit in a neighbourhood that smells like cumin and spray paint. The street outside is quiet. One taxi idles at the far end, its driver asleep against the headrest. A cat moves along the base of the wall with the unhurried specificity of an animal that owns the hour. 2 blocks away, in an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building with a broken elevator that has been broken for 7 months, Noah Shalev is awake. She is not at the warehouse. She has not been to the warehouse or anywhere like it for 4 years. She knows it is there, can hear the bass from her window as a vibration more than a sound, a pressure at the edge of perception, the same frequency that once meant Friday had finally arrived. She's sitting on the floor of her living room with her back against the couch, a half-finished glass of water on the table beside her, the window cracked 2 centimetres to let in the October air. She is not in distress. She's awake in the particular way of people who have trained themselves to observe their own states rather than simply inhabit them, an attentiveness that Shira Katz's Tuesday group had given her, slowly, in the same way that anything given slowly is given in a form that stays. She is, by the measures available to her, better, genuinely better. The emotional range that had contracted through 2018 and 2019 had widened again over 4 years of abstinence, not to exactly where it had been before, not yet, possibly not ever in precisely that form, but wider. The Tuesday morning feeling of a life lived slightly translated had receded. Good meals registered as good. Her mother's voice on the phone landed where it was supposed to land. She had finished 3 books in the past 6 months, which would not have been possible 2 years ago, because finishing a book required sustaining a quality of absorption that the depleted serotonin system could not reliably maintain. The fern she had overwatered to death in 2019 had been replaced eventually by a different plant, a pothos, nearly impossible to kill, a fact she had verified extensively before purchasing it. It was growing along the windowsill with the slow, indifferent momentum of something that does not need to be watched to proceed. Outside, the bass continues. The warehouse crowd is in its 3rd hour. Whatever is happening in there is, for the people inside it, the realest thing occurring anywhere in the world at this moment. The specific quality of collective experience that MDMA produces, the dissolution of the usual membrane between self and others, the flood of chemical warmth that feels while it lasts, like what human connection is supposed to feel like at its most unguarded. That feeling is real. The chemistry that produces it is real. What it costs and how much, and whether the person taking it knows the cost in advance. Those are the variables that determine everything, and they are the variables that a century of institutional failure has most consistently failed to address honestly. The story did not begin in that warehouse. It began in a laboratory in Darmstadt in 1912. Anton Kurlish died in September 1916 on the Western Front, 33 years old, killed in a war that had nothing to do with the compound he had filed a patent on 4 years earlier. He left no wife, no children, no published scientific papers of any particular significance. His name appears in pharmaceutical history only in footnotes, usually one sentence, usually noting that he synthesized MDMA in 1912 while working on something else entirely, and that he died before he could know what he'd made. He never knew about the US Army's classified experiments. He never knew about Shulgin's backyard laboratory in California. He never knew that a Jungian therapist in Oakland would call his compound Adam, or that a Texas entrepreneur would rename it Ecstasy, or that a DEA administrator would ban it against his own judge's ruling, or that the ban would accelerate rather than stop its spread, or that it would travel through a diamond corridor between Amsterdam and Tel Aviv and enter the bodies of a generation that used it to manage the specific psychological weight of living in a country at permanent low-grade war with itself and its neighbours. He never knew any of it. He made a molecule on a Tuesday, filed the paperwork and went back to work. The molecule did not care. Molecules do not have intentions. They behave according to their chemistry in whatever environment they encounter. A military testing room, a therapy couch, a Dallas nightclub, a Goa beach, a Florentine warehouse, an apartment bathroom at 3 a.m., a PET scanner at Tel Aviv University, a community centre room that smells like instant coffee. The same molecule, in all of those places, doing the same thing to the same neurological machinery. Flooding, depleting, restoring, depleting again, the cycle running until the environment around it changed enough to interrupt it. The environment has not changed enough. Not yet. The MAPS researchers are currently designing the additional trials the FDA requested. The timeline is at minimum 3 years, possibly 5. The patients with treatment-resistant PTSD who would be eligible for MDMA-assisted therapy under an approved protocol are, for those 3 to 5 years, without that option. Some of them will find the compound anyway, through channels that do not come with clinical supervision or integration support or the 6 to 8 week spacing that separates therapeutic use from compounding depletion. Some of them will be fine, some of them will not. The distribution networks that supplied Noah Shalev's neighborhood, and every neighborhood like it in Tel Aviv, continue to operate. The El Al cargo route remains one of the highest volume MDMA corridors into Israel. The harm reduction organizations are better funded than they were in 2018, better staffed, more visible at festivals, more integrated into the public health infrastructure, and they are managing a crisis whose upstream causes remain untouched. Pill testing exists, education exists. The supply chain that makes pill testing necessary has not been addressed at its source. The Shin Bet files are still classified. Tamar Friedman's investigation was never formally followed up by any government body. The Knesset's Intelligence Subcommittee has met in closed session on related matters at least 4 times since 2019. No public record of those meetings' conclusions exists. David Weiss is still alive. He is 83 years old and lives in Marin County in a house where the lights no longer need to stay on at night. A change that arrived in 1983 and has, with interruptions, held for 4 decades. He has given 3 recorded interviews to oral history projects documenting the underground therapeutic era. In each of them he says a version of the same thing. that the 3 sessions in 1983 and 1984 gave him back a life he had considered essentially over, and that the FDA's inability to reach a conclusion that his own experience had reached 40 years ago is something he has decided at 83 not to spend energy being angry about. There are limited uses for anger at this altitude, he says. He says it without bitterness. The oral history project that recorded him has been cited in 2 academic papers. It has not been cited in any regulatory filing. Noah Shalev turns 31 this year. She still attends the Tuesday group in Florentin. Not every week, but most weeks. Not because she requires it in the way she once would have, but because the room and the people in it have become a kind of anchor, a Tuesday evening check-in with a version of herself that knows what the other version paid for not knowing. Shira Katz is still the facilitator. The coffee machine in the hallway has been repaired and broken again in the intervening years. In the apartment on the 3rd floor, the pothos on the windowsill catches the light from the street below. The pale orange of a working streetlight, steady and continuous. Noah sits on the floor with her water glass and her open window, and the bass from the warehouse pressing faintly against the October air, and she is thinking about something she described at the Tuesday group 2 weeks ago, in the flat, specific language she uses for the thing she's decided to look at directly. She described the version of herself at 22, sitting in that South Tel Aviv apartment, holding a small white capsule in her palm. She described how the person who made the decision to swallow it had made it without understanding what was actually being decided. Not because she was reckless, not because the information wasn't somewhere in the world, but because the information had never been put in her path by anyone whose job it should have been to put it there. She described the 5 years that followed as a relationship with a molecule that had given her something real and taken something real in return, and the 4 years after that as the slow, unspectacular, mostly Tuesday evening work of understanding what the exchange had actually consisted of. She did not describe it as a tragedy. She did not describe it as a mistake. She described it as something that happened, with causes that extended far beyond the moment of decision, inside a system that had been failing the decision long before she was asked to make it. The group listened. Shira Katz took a note. Outside, somewhere in the direction of Florentine, a siren briefly rose and fell. The warehouse is still going. It will go until dawn. The pills inside it have already been consumed, or already in the bloodstreams of 4,000 people who came to that building, because what it offered, the particular temporary restoration of a quality of feeling that the ordinary week does not provide, was worth, to them, whatever it cost. Some of them know what it costs. Most of them don't. The information that would allow them to make a fully informed decision exists in journals and clinical reports and sealed government files, and the experience of people who are no longer in the warehouse, but are 2 blocks away on a Tuesday evening, in a room that smells like coffee. That information has not found its way to the warehouse, not in any systematic, structured institutional form, not in the 112 years since Anton Kulisch filed his patent on Christmas Eve in 1912 and went home. Not yet. The pothos grows along the windowsill. The bass continues. The October air comes through the cracked window in small, steady intervals, as if the city itself is breathing. In, out, in, not quite resolved, holding the last note of something that hasn't finished playing. Anton Kulisch made a molecule. He had no idea what it was for. A century later, neither does anyone in a position to decide.